All right, hey there, data lovers, and welcome to another I Love Data Fridays here at the International Data Evaluation Center on the campuses of The Ohio State University. And ladies and gentlemen, I am so glad that you can join me today for our episode 19 of I Love Data Fridays, where our topic is today, what is a standard deviation? And more importantly, why do I care? So before we get started, I just wanted to point out one thing today. We are going to do a Q&A session at the end after I get done with the slides here, so you can ask me questions about things that I've talked about. If you're wondering where you do that at, there's a chat window on the YouTube live page. I'm going to bring over an example here. So right now you're probably watching the video on this screen right here, and just off to the right is a little chat window where you can type something in. Heck, you can even say hi to me right now if you are watching me live. All right, so folks, who's talking data to you today? Well, of course, you've got me, Jeff Breimer-Bashore, Director of IT and Operations here at the International Data Evaluation Center. And as I said today, we're going to be talking about the standard deviation. So we're going to answer a few questions today. First of all, what is the standard deviation? All right, what is this statistical thing, the standard deviation? Next, we're going to talk about of what use is it to us? Like, why should we even care about the standard deviation? All right, I know some of you might be saying, well, Jeff, that's the column on my tables that I always skip over because I'm not sure what it's telling me. Well, today we're going to tell you what it's about and how we can use it. And then finally, we're going to talk about, what can it tell me about my students? So this standard deviation it imparts information to us about our students and our data. So we're going to talk about it, describe what it says about your students. All right, so let's get ready to talk a little data. Okay, so here we go. What is a standard deviation? And the first thing, it is not that thing that you skip over in your tables because you're not sure what it's telling you, all right? So what it really actually tells us is the standard deviation tells us how much our data varies from the mean or the average. So how much variation is in our data, and specifically how much does it vary from the average? All right, so the standard deviation and the average, they kind of work together to go hand in hand together to tell us things about our data. The average giving us a number that is the most centrally representative number of our student data, and then the standard deviation tells us how much that varies in general. Our data varies from the average or the mean. All right. So when we look at a report, when you look at standard deviations in the report, they usually see these sort of abbreviations for it. This S or SD or STD DEV or STD period DEV. All right. These are all some of the common notations when people are showing standard deviations in data that they use in reports and tables. All right, so here is an example table we're going to take a look at. So this is table 3.6 from our national report from the 2016-17 school year, and we are looking at the concepts about print. And here we can see we've got, I'm just going to look at this first row right here. It's showing the concept of print data for our discontinued students. And you can see that in the fall, there were just over almost 16,000 kids that had a concepts about print score represented by the N. The mean score at the beginning of the year for our discontinued kids was a 13.1. And here we are, your friend and mine, the standard deviation, as indicated by the SD abbreviation. In the fall, the kids on their concepts about print score had a standard deviation of 3.1. All right, so there you go. That's just what is the standard deviation? How do we find it in a table and everything? All right, so there it is. We can see that this table, it appears twice. We also get a standard deviation for our scores. at the end of the school year as well. And so I'll just repeat here. Remember, where we're going to see it, that our standard deviation and our mean, they work together to tell us some information about our students. All right, so you're telling us, I'm telling you guys, you know, what use is it to us? Well, here we go. We're going to learn about a little sort of standard deviation rule of thumb. All right. So, and I'm gonna explain it here, and then we'll kind of do a practical example together. So 68% of your students, so for example, in that table back in one screen, 68% of our students fall within one standard deviation away from the mean, above and below, meaning that if we took the mean, added one standard deviation, and subtracted one standard deviation and got two different numbers, 68% of our students fall within that first standard deviation. The next thing we know, in our rule of thumb, is that 95% of our students are two standard deviations away from the mean, above and below. So if we took the standard deviation value again and subtracted it from the two numbers we just computed, added and subtracted, 95% of the students would lie within that range. And then finally, the third rule of thumb is that 99.7% of our students are three standard deviations away from the mean, above and below. So in general, 68% of our students, or a simple majority of our students, are one standard deviation away from the mean. A vast majority, or almost all of our students, are two standard deviations away. 95% of our students live within two standard deviations of the mean. And then finally, 99.7% of our students, practically all of them, are three standard deviations away from the mean. So what the heck does that mean in real world practicality? Let me bring up table 3.6 again, and I'm going to fire up a calculator here. Bring Mr. Calculator over to the window as well. Hello, Mr. Calculator. Good to see you again. So let's do an example of this rule of thumb, okay? So I said earlier that 68% of our students are within one standard deviation above and below the mean, okay? So I'm actually going to bring up another little window here. I need some space to write down some stuff. So I'm going to bring Mr. Calculator, move that out of the way. All right, so, oops, window, there we go. So 68% of our students lie within one standard deviation above and below the mean, all right? So all that means is I'm going to take my mean, this 13.1, I am going to add 3.1 to it, plus 3.1, and that gives me 16.2. All right, I'm just going to put that down here in my notes, 16.2. Now I'm going to take that same 13.1, the mean, and subtract 3.1 from it, minus 3.1, and that gives us a value of 10. All right. So I'm just going to write this kind of out in plain English. Between 10 and 16.2, 68, this is where, essentially what it's saying, this is where 68% of our discontinued children are. Remember, we're looking at the discontinued line. So between 10 and 16.2, one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean. This is where 16.60 we can find 68% of our kids right there. All right. So now, if I subtract another 3.1 from 10, so between, let's see, 6.9, and if I add then another 3.1 to 16.2, 19.3, this is where 95, this area, this range of scores from a concepts about print from 6.9 to 19.3, this is where 95%, this would encompass 95% of our kids are included in this range. And then finally, if we go one more time, a third standard deviation away, So I am going to subtract an additional 3.1, the standard away from the 6.9. 6.9 minus 3.1, it's 3.8. And I add 3.1 to our 19.3. That's a 22.4. So 99.7% of our kids are their scores fall within a 3.8 and a 22.4. So this technique can be used with any mean and any standard deviation. This does not just apply to concepts about print or discontinued kids of concept about print. We can do this with, say, our recommended kids and start with our mean and add 3.3 and subtract 3.3 and get one standard deviation and find where 68% of our kids lie. All right, so this is telling us, so essentially what the standard deviation is telling us is sort of the spread of our children, you know, how spread out or how compact are our children in our data. So which brings me to my next topic here, question. So as I'm saying, what can it tell me about my students? You know, what can the standard deviation tell me about my students? And essentially it can tell us how similar our kids are to each other. You know, how similar or dissimilar. So in general, the smaller the standard deviation, the more alike your students are for a particular assessment. So let's take an example here, okay? We're going to look at the OS total score, and I've taken this chart out of the US norms document on the website, and this looks for this document. There is we've got data for fall, mid-year, and year-end, and for each time period at fall, mid-year, and year-end, look, we've got our means. So at fall, the mean score is about a 4, rounded up to about a 433, 513, and a 554. And then right next to it, remember, your friend and mine, the standard deviation is right here. So with about a 53, we'll round that up to 44 and a 40. So remember what I said, that the smaller the standard deviation, the more alike your children are. So notice how the school, and this chart is for random sample kids. So notice how when the school year moves along from fall to mid-year to year-end, our standard deviation gets smaller and smaller. So as the school year goes along, our children, the random sample children, are becoming more alike. They are less spread out. There is less variation among them. And if we think about that in a practical way, you know, we would hope to see this. I mean, our kids are entering first grade and they're getting instruction in literacy, and we would hope to see that they benefit from this literacy instruction and they all start having a similar skill or becoming more alike. And so this is, you can see this in the chart though. I've taken this chart is from the US norms document as well. And these are our histograms. So we're showing the spread of kids at the fall, the distribution of scores for the total score at fall, mid-year, and year-end. So at the bottom of the chart for each of these charts is the range of the OS total score. And then as the bars or the bell curve gets higher, more kids got that particular score. So, you know, this should look pretty familiar to people, sort of this bell curve. But what I want to point out as a difference is, so I said earlier with the standard deviation that our kids by the end of the year were more alike than they were at the start of the year. They've gotten instruction and they've become more alike. And you can see this reflected in the chart. How do we see this? Well, I'm going to look at fall and we're going to look at year end. So, and we're going to think of terms of wanting to ski down a ski slope. Notice how on this one, we've got a nice sort of gentle slope on our curve here, you know, something I'd probably want to ski down, not too tough for me to tackle. And that the kids are, you know, the highest point is definitely in the center right there. But if we look over to now look at year end, there's a steeper slope, More of our kids have moved away from the sides and they moved to the center. So notice how the tip of the bar is starting to get up to this third line here, and with this other chart, it's not quite up to the third line. So our kids have squished towards the center. They become more alike, all right? And this is what the standard deviation has told us. Now, just one example of how, so I've said they're more, we hope that they become more alike, but it was fun. I was looking at different charts and standard deviations for the different subtasks of the observation survey, and I found the writing vocabulary. So here is that same chart we've seen earlier, but for writing vocabulary for fall, mid-year, and year-end. And when I look at the standard deviation, we see something a little different, that as our kids, at least on writing vocabulary, as they get to the year end, there is a bigger they become more spread out. They have a different, it tells me that they're having more variation in the amount of words that each child knows, that some kids have a bigger vocabulary than others, that there's a bigger difference. And we can see that once again in the charts. So in the fall, the kids all have, they're much more similar. You notice how we get the height of the bar there, it gets up above 300 there, over is that 300? Well, maybe at the most someone knew 300 words or something, I think. And they all kind of compact to the middle of the curve there. And then and has very steep sides to it. But as we go through the school year, the peak comes down, the children spread out along the curve, and the curve becomes on the curve there on the histogram the slope becomes less. So just an interesting thing that I saw. But the standard deviation told us this, that the kids had a similar amount of vocabulary knowledge and in the fall, and they differed a little bit more at the year end, some kids having more than words than others. So, okay, final review, and then I'll give some time for people to type in some questions. So remember, our standard deviation, it tells us how much our data varies from the mean, or sometimes we call that the average, all right? So it tells us how much variation is in our data. And remember, we have this rule of thumb whenever we use a standard deviation. We can always know that 68% of our students lie within one standard deviation away from the mean. So you take the mean, you add the standard deviation, subtract the standard deviation, and that gives you the range for one standard deviation, and 68% of the kids are there. If we add and subtract the standard deviation again, 95% of our kids fall within that range. And then if we do it one more time, add and subtract the standard deviation, it gives us a range where 99.7% of our kids fall within. And really, what I really hope you're really getting from this is that what the standard deviation can tell us is when the smaller the standard deviation, when you see it in your data, the more alike your students are for a particular assessment. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to open it up for questions here, so I'll remain quiet for a minute or two, and we'll see if any questions roll in. I will read the questions off the screen as they come in. As we are waiting for questions, I will also say, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, if you look down below this video, there's a nice big red button that says subscribe. So if you click on that red subscribe button, you'll get notifications when new I Love Data Friday videos or any videos that we put out on IDEC. And just a reminder, our next I Love Data Fridays is going to be on October the 6th. So we will be sending out announcements on October the 6th where you can send in your data-related questions. All right, I'm still waiting for something to come in here, if anything's coming in. We'll give it another 20 seconds here, and if not, if no one's writing in, then we will go ahead and sign out. All right. Well, it looks like we're not going to have any questions today, but that's okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will say thank you for watching another edition of I Love Data Fridays, folks. And we will talk the data to you later.